Hello, I'm David Hunt, CEO and founder of the Hyperion Cleantech Group and your host for the Leaders in Cleantech podcast. Today, I've got a great guest with us, a chap I've known for quite some time, doing some great things in around flexibility and the evolution of the energy transition. James Johnston, CEO and founder of Piclo. James, welcome.
Thank you, David. Great to be here.
So loads of exciting stuff going on in the world with the transition and importantly balancing the grid and flexibility and all that wonderful stuff. It's really good to get your view on what you have done, what you are doing, what you're looking to do as a business. But always, as you know, like to look a little bit into people's backgrounds and the genesis of businesses. So perhaps you can share a little bit of what brought you to the point of founding Piclo.
Well, it's a fair few years ago now. So, we celebrated our 10-year anniversary just about a month ago. So, been striving forward with our mission for some time, as it were. So, back to early 2013, we were sort of bright-eyed and definitely looking to change the world positively. Still are, but. We, look at the genesis of the idea. Actually, it came from looking at the internet, believe it or not, and how a decentralized mode of communication has transformed the world of communication, and how you could sort of take some of the lessons of that decentralized system and apply it in the energy world. That's where we started from. Where we would fit into this kind of Internet of Energy vision is that of a new kind of energy market, one that was designed from the get-go to work well with distributed energy resources, low-carbon energy resources. And so that's the genesis of the idea. And then the last 10 years has really been a story of how we've tried to find, how to find product market fit with really complex environments. There's regulations, there's policy, there's systems, and how we can get that embedded in the market and make some traction. And it's difficult. I think that's the short story. It's a difficult industry, fundamentally an industry which needs to go through massive change, but has 120 odd years of legacy systems approaches to kind of go through that transition. So it's not easy. It's not a quick thing, but it is absolutely necessary. So yeah, it's not for the faint-hearted. Both to attack and disrupt an industry, as you've alluded to there, but also as a business, because again, as with most startups, there's a little bit of pivoting, a bit of finding your feet, and a bit of sort of evolution as the markets change. Which I know that over the years when we've spoken, that's been sort of something in the background. But just before we dig into that, again, it's. Your experience, I think, when we first became aware, actually was with the solar industry, and that's your sort of you had that experience there. But I'm intrigued as to how you went pretty much straight from academia and university and studying and research and internship to creating a business, because that's quite brave at the early stages of your career. Was there always a draw to be an entrepreneur, or did you fall into that, or how did you sort of come to found businesses rather than going into a corporate environment? That's a good question. So I spent a number of years as a PhD candidate, and the funding ended for that. And typically you go down one of two routes at that point. One, you get a job, or two, you stay in academia. You get some postdoctoral funding, and you see your thesis through. And I went down the third route, which was not recommended by any of my peers or family at the time, which was to take even more of a risk and start my own thing. But yes, I've always been very entrepreneurial driven. At university, I was a membership in the leadership team within the Students in Free Enterprise, also in the Enterprise Society of the organization. I was very much exposed to that world, and I guess it's maybe a bit of my own personality type showing through here. I'm quite stubborn, I'm quite independent, and naturally that sort of leads me to be wanting to do my own thing, as it were, rather than jumping on the corporate ladder directly. So combination of things, but it wasn't an accident. I've always wanted to have my own thing, really.
Right, right. It is such an interesting thing that entrepreneurs come in so many shapes and forms and backgrounds, and there are, like yourself, a number that we've had on the podcast who've been from academia and from obviously studying doctorates and from achieving PhDs, which people often think that doesn't align with entrepreneurship, but clearly, like you say, if the underlying characteristics are there and the drive to be there, there's some very successful like yourself, and think of P. Armstrong at Mixie, but who've come from that arena and done really well. So we might revisit that, and we will revisit a little bit of the evolution of Piclo, because that's really fascinating. But perhaps for the audience, you can share a little bit about what Piclo is all about, what the current sort of business model is, and what you're doing presently.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about our evolution, because it has evolved, pivoted. We've pivoted to use that phrase. So what Piclo is, we're a flexibility marketplace. So grid flexibility, as you alluded to, is an essential part of the energy transition. The grid itself becomes a barrier to decarbonisation, because the wind, the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow when you need energy. You need to fill in the gaps. Flexibility is another way of saying you can fill in the gaps to when there's no generation, but also the fixed capacity, the fixed size of the grid means that you can have time and location specific congestion problems on the network, and these can become quite big. The big issue in the UK right now is actually on the transmission network. The level of constraints between getting the wind, which is generated typically mostly in Scotland, and the demand centre in England, and you have actually a transmission level constraint. But there's also constraints on a street by street level. You can imagine with electric vehicles being deployed. Doesn't take too many Tesla superchargers in a particular part of the grid before you're coming up against those limits on the network. And so flexibility is not just for sort of used for balancing, it is also used for managing some of these constraints on specific parts of the grid. So that is explaining flexibility. Our role within this is that of a marketplace. So the grid companies, these are both the distribution network operators as well as transmission network operators. They essentially go onto our platform and can source flexibility. They can run a procurement process via Piclo. They can essentially run their flexibility service via our platform, and they can settle and pay providers through our platform as well. So we provide that end-to-end marketplace offering. And in terms of our traction, most of it's been in the UK to date, but we're now starting to get some exciting traction internationally. We have facilitated upwards of $70 million worth of contracts via our platform over the last couple of years. We have, I think, approaching 150 flex service providers who are registered participating. We have 9 grid operators on the platform, and we facilitated 1.1 gigawatts of flexibility contracts, I think, over the years as well. So we're starting to get some real proof points that this is a really important model and actually quite scalable.
Yeah. There are so many moving parts, or obviously technically not many moving parts in terms of the grid. Like you say, there's a lot of old historic legacy infrastructure which needs to be moved. But in terms of the business model, when you've got obviously the DNOs, the TSOs with whom are your customers, you've got people offering flexibility, and obviously the financial side to balance these things. How has that been? Because obviously you've got to balance the need from the grid side. You've got to convince people to offer their flexibility in their generation and usage, and of course it's a highly changing, or has been a highly changing regulatory environment. So that must have been a tough thing to start to always try and balance all of those plates at once.
Well, I think it's really time to tell you a little bit of the story of Piclo that can help answer this one. So actually we started, I gave you the original, a very high level idea of creating an internet of energy, or a decentralized marketplace. That sort of, the first sort of approach was more specifically in the energy trading world. So we developed a peer-to-peer energy trading platform, and this was the vision for us at this time was to enable generators to sell energy to their neighbors. So you could buy your energy from your neighbor's solar panel, which sounds very nice and it's very intuitive, but the regulatory setup of the industry, the system setup doesn't accommodate that model. Yeah. So we were always looking what we called this holy grail model, where if you could make more money by selling locally, or pay less for your energy by buying locally, that would create this win-win scenario for peer-to-peer trading. Mm-hmm. And it was that's when we started looking very, very closely at distribution networks, because that seemed to be holding the key between the two. If you could evidence via a peer-to-peer transaction that you're using less of the grid, could you pay for less of the grid? And that's actually a really complex societal question around fairness and equity and how you actually pay for shared infrastructure. It is not such an easy subject. But it was in that process that we discovered this concept of reinforcement deferral. And actually there was essentially a sizable budget that was potentially available if you could demonstrate local balancing and therefore, avoiding some of these congestion issues that I was talking about. And it was in this sort of process that we then realized, we had this sort of flash of inspiration, that we were trying to solve a problem with a really complex solution, a peer-to-peer trading system and self-balancing. If the problem was trying to, support the energy transition, get more renewables and EVs on the grid by more efficiently managing these networks, then we should do that directly. So then we sort of pivoted the idea of a marketplace away from an energy trading marketplace to a grid flexibility marketplace, in which case the grid itself is the one that is buying the services on the platform rather than the peer-to-peer arrangement. So it was the peer-to-peer model, that spent the first 5 years of the company looking at this and trying to iterate and scale this up. It never really went anywhere, but it was kind of fundamental for us building the knowledge and understanding to pivot into this new model, which has really found that product market fit and is actually scaling really, really well. So,
and there was a name change as part of that as well. Is that right, James?
That's right. So we started our life as open utility, and we started. So we Piclo was the name of our product. Notionally you could say pick local or pick low carbon. It was around this peer-to-peer idea. And then over time, as my co-founder guessed at the time, he said this will become the name of our company, and which it did, because Piclo is a unique brand and one that's now well known in the sector. So we sort of pushed open utility to the side, focused on Piclo.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of other parts of the journey that were challenging, as you say, always looking for product market fit and evolving, as many clean tech or any startup businesses tend to do. So how did you manage that from a personal perspective of realizing that you had a great idea but it didn't just quite fit into the market? You've obviously evolved into one that does. At the same time, you've got to balance building a business, hiring people, fundraising. I know you haven't done an awful lot of that, but obviously you've had some funding from various places along the line. So perhaps tell us some of the challenges and key points or rewarding points in those earlier years before you got to the stage where you're at now.
I think first of all, what keeps a company going for 10 years, or what keeps a founder or a group of founders together, is a clear mission. Why are you doing this? Our mission is to decarbonize the grid. And, I'm often guilty of, head in the clouds, spending a lot of time thinking the next 10 years, what's the industry going to look like? And some things for me that seem obvious that actually for people that are in the real world are a little bit imaginary or made up of. So for me, 2 years into our first product, I was already thinking that, right, we need to involve the grid, there needs to be around congestion. And I was already starting to think about where this was needing to go. But then, the challenge is you've got an organization which is actually, focused on delivering, executing the here and now. And how do you bring everyone along on the journey? So I used the word pivot, but that pivot took 18 months. It's not an immediate thing. We actually had a paying customer of our service that we had to reach the end of that contract before we could officially shut down our peer-to-peer service. So there are difficulties in that, but fundamentally, what has kept us going is the ethos around that mission-driven approach. And then secondly, we early on as a company, right down back in 2014, I think, we sat down as a founding group and said, well, what are our values as a business? Right. And we came up with a list of 6 values, which still hold today. And I think a combination of having clear value set and a clear mission, even if you're not even working on the right solution at that time, you need to pivot, and the whole ethos of what the product is what we did. Yep. You can still go through that transition and survive, and hopefully thrive as well.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because again, that clarity of mission and values and that North Star, I think, are critical from the companies I've worked with, and hopefully from my own as well, because it is very tempting when things aren't always 100% as you expect to see some shiny things, some markets or some opportunities or some connections that are tempting, but they're not necessarily core to what you really want to stick to. And it can be brave sometimes to stick to that when there are some of these distractions or shiny things that could perhaps solve an itch in the short term, but clearly don't get you to where you are now or to where you want to get to.
Yeah, I think for us that would translate into we find it hard to sacrifice on quality. So even if it means taking longer to do something, or we had prioritized spending time making a higher quality product rather than trying to earn some additional money through some service arrangements in parallel. We always come back to what is it that sort of stands out as our USP as a business, and that is one of the things that not just our product but our whole end-to-end process for developing our product and focusing on users. That is actually one other key thing just to say about our pivots. We started the peer-to-peer product almost with the wrong lens. We started with the technology. We developed this pretty cool technology. I think it's still pretty cool. Hopefully we can get it back at some point. But it started the technology and went on the hunt for a good problem that it could solve. Right. And we never found it because of the regulatory constraints, etc. So when we started on the flex market, for the first 6 months, we actually didn't build anything at all. We were working very closely with our partners at the time within an innovation project. We're partnered initially with UK Power Networks. We spent the first 6, almost 9 months really just sort of shadowing them as they were running their own procurement process, kind of highlighting where we could add value in the process and where we could sort of deploy some software or a marketplace solution type solution to help solve some of those pain points. And that sort of user-centered approach rather than technology-centered approach is really an ethos which drives us now as a business. So I think that's also really important to kind of highlight.
Yeah, it is. And again, I think I've touched on this on previous podcasts sometimes, and it does work out as it has, again, sometimes, but not always. If you do have, like you say, you have a solution looking for a problem rather than a problem looking for a solution, that kind of evolution. But clearly you've obviously evolved from that. I mean, the market's now so drastically different from when you started. I was joking with a colleague last week that when I started my solar business back in 2007, and one of our early commercial installations, we were contacting the DNO, the distribution DNO, to get grid connected, and one of the people in the office said that it's not possible for you to send electricity back down the grid, and so you go from a world of, clearly that wasn't everybody within the DNO, but you go for that lack of understanding or lack of knowledge of how the grid does work, because clearly that's how it did work, very much one direction, to a world now where constraints and the ability to connect solar or storage assets to the grid is one of, constraints, local power constraints are one of the key issues. So there's been a lot of change. How have you, as a business been able to keep at the forefront of that and keep providing these solutions and keep working with organizations that enable what's happening? And where do you see the biggest opportunities and challenges for the business for Piclo at the present time?
I think how we stay on top of it is we're helping we're at the forefront of all of this. So which means the things that we're working on now will be the things that people will be talking about more broadly in 12, 18 months time. So that's how we stay on top of it. We write the future rather than read it. What are the things that are, the really exciting sort of evolution of the market? I would describe it as, it sounds quite mundane, but I think the thing which is going to really start shining through over the next 12, 18 months is revenue stacking.
Right.
So this is not a new topic, but it is, and broadly what this is, from a flex provider's perspective, let's say you're a battery storage operator, the ability to enter multiple markets and provide multiple services and stack those revenues efficiently, so that you can, run your asset profitably and actually run a successful business. It's not a new concept. It's been around for years. But I think, and there's been quite a lot of focus on some of the perhaps regulatory or market rules, barriers, contractual barriers that are being addressed by the various different entities, either governmental level or within the system operators. Yeah. But the thing which has been kind of lagging behind that is on the IT side, the software capabilities that really enable this to scale. And that's the sort of, that's an area we're really focusing on at Piclo, not just with our own technologies, but in terms of our interactions with our clients as well. Okay. And I perceive, certainly, if you look at some of the main revenue stack, the main market opportunities out there, there's still a lot of work to do to kind of blend this all together so that the vision really here is a single, via a single marketplace, whether that's through a API access or through a user interface or whatever, is access to everything, and being able to seamlessly add together all these different revenue opportunities. So clear value proposition for the providers, but also a very clear value proposition for the buyers of flexibility as well. So for individual, DNOs who are, trying to build more market liquidity and get more interest in this, they will see more participation, because providers that, if they're looking at a DNO opportunity in a silo, they're like, well, it's quite a lot of effort to get a incremental revenue opportunity. But if it's just as simple as opting into additional markets because everything is through the same interface, that changes the ball game. And then from a sort of a system-wide perspective, once you start to really tackle this revenue stacking point, you can create some real system-wide efficiencies where you're really the idea of a marketplace in general is you're making transparent where there are pools of value to be had. The idea of a marketplace is you drive supply and demand. So if there's pools of value that are not being addressed, there's higher pockets of value. There should be more investment into them, whether these are locational pools of or technology-specific pools. More investment, more driving operational signals into particular areas. So that for me is going to be, and there are all sorts of associated things, whether this is like open APIs, which will become increasingly a popular topic in relation to this. Looking at all the different how these market rules interact. If you look at, for example, the Ofgem announced a series of consultations last week, which I would recommend everyone to take a look at. This is again some of the key topics that come up again and again. How to bridge all these different markets and make it so streamlined that you can access all of them in a single place, like a Piclo, for example.
Yeah, there's lots of things that are evolved and growing in the Piclo business, which we'll refer to, because as we said, some of these issues are international, and I know that you talked about expanding already, but throwing back as an entrepreneur, coming out of academia, we touched on before, but during those early years and for many years, you've been obviously behind the visionary side of things. You've been clearly involved very heavily in the technical development of the platform and of the product offering. You've also been very much involved in the commercial and almost like the face in the commercial and the sales element of the business. So which of those hats have you enjoyed the most, and how has it been a challenge to sort of manage all of that, or to wear those hats as the business scales and as the market's evolving around you?
So that's a really good question. Let me go back to the beginning. So I incorporated the company back in early 2013, in January 2013, and the first job I had was to try and find some technical co-founders to join the business, because I self-taught, software developer. I had kind of I could hold my own developing some Python scripts, but really not to any level of quality needed to build a product. So that effectively was the first thing that I knew that I needed to bring in capability that at a founder level.
Right.
And that's when I found Andy at a Clean Web meetup, and that's where we hit it off from there. And Andy then brought along Alice, who actually has a design background, they'd worked together in previous roles. So essentially, pretty early on, I was no longer able to access the code base.
Right.
and whilst I've got an interest and deep knowledge about the technical aspects of the product, I haven't been involved in building the product to any degree. And essentially, other than being CEO, my other kind of main role throughout for the past first 8 years of the business was leading up the commercial side of the business. So that I would probably say that's more the sweet spot for me. So essentially I was acting as chief commercial officer up until when we had John Bayer join the business about a year and a bit ago, and then more or less acting as or partially acting as a chief financial officer as well, prior to Tom Saul joining last summer. So I've been spending more of my own time on the commercial and finance side of things, but always really interested in the product and how it works.
The visionary side is interesting, particularly in areas of disruption. And if we move back to that then, so we're at a stage now where clearly wind and solar in particular have evolved significantly, but are really starting to accelerate again in the UK and beyond. We've got EV charging infrastructure, which only in the last 2 or 3 years is really starting to ramp up and to be a draw or be an issue in places for the grid. And we have a real, if you look at, for example, the Tesla Day, but it's something I've believed in for quite some time, is the electrification of everything as much as is possible. So the demands and the challenges and the bottlenecks and the constraints are going to get worse as we scale up all of this good stuff. So that clearly plays to Piclo. But how do you see the next 2 or 3 years for the business and more broadly for the markets meeting these challenges?
I mean, we're now operating in 6 countries. So we're starting to get quite a broad international view.
Yeah.
The UK is, in my view, right at the front of the pack worldwide in terms of, this connected, to do this properly, you need regulatory innovation.
Yeah.
We're working with grid organizations that are regulated. You might do a little bit of innovation outside of, transforming regulations, but the regulations need to go through a journey, and the UK and Ofgem are leading the pack on that. And I know sometimes there are some frustrations in the UK at the governmental decisions and the process, but the reality is the UK is actually the leading example that other countries are copying and adopting themselves. So that's the first point to make. The change is not all happening equally. Mm-hmm. And, the impacts that we can have as a company by being part of that change in the UK then has a multiplier effect, because then we're seeing this already. A number of other countries that we're deploying across Europe, they're looking at what our clients are doing in the UK, they're looking at what Ofgem is deciding, and going, well, if that works, copy and paste. With then, tweaks, there's always tweaks required for localization, but effectively that's it. So there's a real, coming back to mission alignment, there's a real multiplier effect on our impact working in the UK. And I don't think everyone in the UK energy system who is part of this energy transition really realizes this.
Okay.
Because they might think they themselves need to be expanding their business international to having that international impact. But just being a part of the energy transition here is actually has an outsized impact. So what I see the challenges. So again, challenges that we're going through the UK will be challenges that countries will have to start adopting in the next couple of years.
Yep.
As I said, the thing which is I think of with great importance is scaling up grid flexibility. You're seeing increasing increasing frequency of mainstream publications around the fact that the grid is becoming a bottleneck, whether this is for connections or actually just the amount of curtailment that needs to go on, or in regards to how fast or how smooth electrification of everything can happen. And I agree. You're going to see every single year as it goes past, there's going to be an increase in demand. So it's not going to be like the challenge. It's going to be the same size next year as it is this year. It's going to be bigger. And right now we're not meeting the challenge. We're not deploying flexible solutions, smart grid technologies, scalable solutions fast enough, and we need to do more. And the problem is the challenge is getting harder and harder. And then you have, for example, the grid is getting older every year. It's in a lot of cases it's aging infrastructure, and particularly other countries as well. We're seeing this across the US. Aging infrastructure is a big issue. You're seeing the requirements driven by climate change actually having an impact. So not just electrification of everything is a challenge. The fact that we're using more energy at certain times because of increased heat. You're seeing worse weather as part of more extreme weather, climate events, again driving challenges onto the grid as well. So we need to keep the foot to the floor and on this energy transition, and in particular grid flexibility, because that is right in the middle of a lot of these different kind of components. And as I said, I think the key to unlocking grid flexibility is making it super easy to stack a grid flexibility, a congestion revenue opportunity alongside a national, reserve market opportunity, and making it as simple as possible to stack these different things. That is the key for success here.
I'll touch back on something you talked about there, James, and it's important because, again, there's a lot of discussion at the moment. I was in Brussels recently at the announcement of the Green Deal Industrial Plan, and obviously in a reflection to the IRA in the US. So there's a lot of acceptance and knowledge that we've lost in Europe and in the UK a lot of our advantages in producing and manufacturing a good deal of stuff that's effective in the clean energy and mobility transitions. And I know that for that, because obviously a lot of our clients look at the UK as a place of advance where they can start to deploy some of the technologies. So to your point, the regulatory environment and business models and platforms such as your own that we have in the UK are and should be things that we are and can export to markets. We all know that the US grid is a bit of a dog's dinner of three grids that's in incredibly bad shape, as you just sort of touched on. So how are you finding, you are now obviously exploring into, you said 6 countries. How are you finding that process? Are people coming to you? Are you getting an open door? Or is it like a hallelujah moment when they can see that there are organizations who can offer some kind of solution to what's going on?
I mean, yes and no. So looking at the US, for example, we've got our first pilot there with National Grid in New York. And that's critical because with the US, if there isn't that sort of case study of it working in the US, it's almost disregarded, as it were.
Right.
So so it is important to demonstrate that you understand the local context and you have a local presence and you're building up knowledge. But saying that, having reference customers, not just in the UK but across Europe, is critical. I think what we see is, half the battle is not, it's not just we're a software company selling a software package. We're working with clients that are going through fundamental transformation of their business model. Moving from network operations, which is incentivized by how much copper they have in the ground and how much more lines they build, to one which should be incentivized to run a smart grid. And we're just one part of that, which is, okay, if you're going to have this vision, you need to be able to have a seamless access, reliable access to flexibility. So, we can't just go and sell our software in isolation. It has to be part of a wider transformation that they're doing. So in that regard, it's super important that there are links of communication between the regulatory agencies in the different jurisdictions we're talking with, both across different countries in Europe and in the US and Australia and Japan, but also the individual network operators. They can speak their own language with a counterpart who runs a similar kind of business, and talk about their experiences. And hopefully if that conversation goes well, then they go, well, actually, yes, we need the flexibility market too. And Piclo is becoming the world leading marketplace. So that seems like a no-brainer choice. So that's all, it's not just a simple sales process. It's going through that journey with them. So, but coming back to why do we do all of this? It's because the hard things are sometimes the most valuable things to be doing, and if we can help join up some dots between different countries and different networks in different countries, and shortcut some of the learnings that maybe the UK DNOs and Ofgem have had, build up this knowledge base from scratch by trying out things for the first time. Then again, as that multiplier effect on impact, which is really what we're all about.
So how does the future look? You've done all the things that we've talked about, putting yourself into a market leader position. You've hired some great people, but you've done so on with grants and some relatively small amounts of fundraising. Now there's a whole international opportunity that's complex and not easy, but it's there for organisations like yours. So what's the plans for you and the business evolving in the next 3, 4, 5 years?
So we have we closed our Series A fundraise 2 years ago now with Clean Growth Fund leading that, and with funding from McDonald and the British Business Bank, and that really helped get us to a certain level of scale that in order to be a real credible player in this space, you can't operate as just a couple of people in a garage. You got to have systems. You got to have scale. You got to be able to, especially if you're looking internationally, you need to have international sales teams and everything around that. So that Series A was essential. We will be hopefully, knock on wood, announcing further funding secured in the next couple of months to continue that journey of growth. But we are, I would say, in the category of investments, we are what you call an impact investment case. So, it's not just about, in some ways you could say it's doubly as hard. We're getting venture capital, and we need to return a venture capital sized reward to our shareholders, but also have a major climate, carbon reduction impact on our business. But I don't see these two things as different. I see that if you can, what you should be aiming for is, if you remain focused on having that impact, that global impact, and you can actually achieve the megatons of carbon reduction that you're aiming for, you're going to have a very valuable business as well. And for me, the two things are very intertwined, and therefore that's why we like being in that space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I work with some fabulous VCs and investment funds who are entirely impact orientated and obviously work very actively in this broader space. Well, one thing to close, it's been great to get a view on the company and your own journey, James. I guess where you sit gives you an ideal situation of some of the challenges that we face going through to a sort of a renewables or low carbon dominated grid and energy infrastructure. How more or less optimistic are you that we can get to where we need to be now than you were when you founded the company 10 years ago?
I think that's a really interesting question. So I think on one hand, it's taken us 10 years to get here, and I'd still say we're still in the early foothills of the mountain of success, and success being a successful energy transition. I would say what I think is absolutely, I think this next phase of development, which is all about scale.
Yeah.
It's all about, in terms of energy markets, it's not about designing a fancier market. It's about getting these digital marketplaces which are already proven, and it's about scaling them up. It's about scaling up the value proposition that we can unlock.
Yeah.
And that for me is the challenge for the next 10 years. And that needs there's a real sort of interplay between regulation, policy, IT systems, market rules and participation that need to get you along that journey. And I think my worry would be if there's too much time in sort of talking shop, just debating the finer elements of a theoretical model, and not enough time just going, right, what are the real day-to-day practical barriers for scaling this up? Let's focus on them.
Yeah.
So that's where, that's where you'll find us in the corner of the industry, and very much with the pragmatist hat on, moving things forward. And we'd invite the rest of the industry to come and join us in that corner as well. So moving away from theoretical models, because what we don't need right now is theory. We need practical solutions ASAP, and solutions that are scalable, which is the fundamental thing we need.
Yeah. Scale and speed are essential at this stage. And I am actually more optimistic than perhaps I was, that whilst the challenges exist, we now seem to have, from a regulatory point of view as well, some critical momentum globally to realize that actually this is now time that we need to be making moves forward. And I say, hopefully we're all considering the pragmatist camp with yourself. James, it's been brilliant to spend some time with you. Thanks very much for sharing that. For the audience, we'll share some details on Piclo and some other activities on the episode page, both on the podcast and on the YouTube channel. Subscribe there if you don't already, and you can dig in some more. But James, for now, thanks very much for sharing, and look forward to seeing the future of Piclo as you continue to expand.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.